All right, ladies and gentlemen, that takes us to key concept 4.3, the Columbian Exchange. The term Columbian Exchange was popularized by a historian named Alfred Crosby, who wrote a book called The Columbian Exchange that really started to popularize just how important the exchange of plants and animals and stuff was from the Afro-Eurasian world to the Americas and vice versa. The new connections between the Eastern and Western hemispheres resulted in the exchange of new plants, animals, and diseases that we collectively know as the Columbian Exchange. So, the Columbian Exchange, I would argue this is probably the third most important thing in history. The first being Homo erectus learning how to control fire, allowing us to cook food. The second being the Neolithic Revolution and the advent of farming. But for human populations, the Columbian Exchange is just about the next most important thing in human history. So it talks about the exchange of stuff across the Atlantic. Before the Columbian Exchange, before 1492, the Afro-Eurasian world and the American world were totally different, and they had very different ecologies. Um, so, for example, let's take potatoes, right? In 1450, when this unit starts, no one in Ireland had ever eaten a potato. Potatoes are from Peru and the Andes Mountains. By 1750, by the end of this unit, people in Ireland are eating very little else. That's just one of a great number of examples of how different the worlds were. If I was to guess, I would say this is probably the single most likely topic of your AP exam. Uh, be ready to talk about this in terms of at least four categories. Those four categories to know are number one, plants. Number two, animals. Number three, human beings, apart from the other animals. And number four, diseases. So, first of all, we're going to go with plants. Plants go both directions because, of course, people exchange foods in both directions. The foods that go from Afro-Eurasia to the Americas include wheat, rice, barley, oats, onions, turnips, grapes, sugarcane, bananas, citrus fruits, olives, peaches, pears, and coffee beans. But perhaps more important for world history are the American foods. It turns out that America was home to a whole lot of really useful foods. They include, like, say, pumpkins, sweet potatoes, squash, pineapple, avocados, peppers, cassava, which is really important in West African cuisine, cacao beans, peanuts, potatoes, tomatoes, maize, beans, and vanilla, all of which go to Afro-Eurasia. And they end up having a huge impact on the diets of the people in Afro-Eurasia. So, next up is animals. Animals almost entirely go one direction, although there is some exceptions, like the turkey, for instance, which did make it across the Atlantic. But animals mostly go one direction. The Americans had not domesticated a lot of animals. I mean, they did domesticate some, like the alpaca and the llama and the guinea pig, but the Afro-Eurasian animals ended up being a lot more important, and they almost entirely went one direction. They go from Afro-Eurasia to the Americas. They involve cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses. Next, human beings almost entirely go one direction, and that is from Afro-Eurasia to the Americas. And that includes mostly African slaves. Probably in this time period, 80% of the people that go from Afro-Eurasia to the Americas are African slaves, and maybe only 20% people from Europe, and then maybe a few people from Asia, but not many in this time period. Next, diseases almost entirely go one direction, if not entirely, and that's from Afro-Eurasia to the Americas. Diseases included smallpox, influenza, typhoid fever, measles, malaria, diphtheria, and whooping cough. And those diseases would be totally devastating on American populations when they encountered Americans who had not developed any biological resistance to that with their immune systems. European colonization of the Americas led to the unintentional transfer of disease vectors. Disease vectors include mosquitoes and rats, and the spread of diseases that were endemic in the Eastern Hemisphere, including smallpox, measles, and malaria. Smallpox was totally devastating to Native American populations, maybe alone killing about 50% of the population of North and South America. And even those that survived, many of them were left for the rest of their lives with horrible smallpox marks all over their bodies. Some of these diseases substantially reduced the indigenous populations with catastrophic effects in many areas. In Mexico, for instance, as of 1518, the population was probably something like 25 million people. By 1548, that population had dropped to about 6 million people. American foods became staple crops in various parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Cash crops were grown primarily on plantations with coerced labor in especially the Caribbean, Brazil, and to a lesser extent, Dixie. And they were mostly exported to Europe and the Middle East in this time period. Cash crops included, say, sugar or tobacco. Afro-Eurasian fruit trees, grains, sugar, and domesticated animals were brought by Europeans to the Americas, while other fruits were brought by African slaves. Domesticated animals included horses, which helped to create entire different new cultures of people inside the Americas, like, for instance, the Sioux, pigs, and cattle. Foods that were brought by African slaves included rice and okra. Populations in Afro-Eurasia benefited nutritionally from the increased diversity of American food crops. More diverse foods meant more vitamins in their diet usually, and when they brought foods from the Americas to Afro-Eurasia, they usually were able to leave the diseases to those foods behind, at least until later. The Irish potato famine around 1845 would show what happened when those diseases spread. Ladies and gentlemen, that's Key Concept 4.3, the Columbian Exchange.